November 22nd, 1963. It's a pretty famous date. It's the date that JFK was assassinated in Dallas. Something else happened on that day, and of course that was a very significant day for our country. Something else happened that was probably not as significant that day, but has certainly proven to be significant over the course of history. There were two guys that were flying over some swampland in Florida. And as they were flying over, they were looking for particular locations. And one of the things that they noticed was a spot where there was an intersection between Interstate 4 in Florida and some other highways that were close by. So they began to actually purchase that property. Now, you can't just buy a lot of acres without people noticing. So they set up some dummy corporations to be able to buy small parcels or smaller parcels at a time. They began buying land for $80 an acre, $80 an acre for swampland in central Florida. And they acquired 27,000 acres over the course of time. Well, then construction began, and what they began to see was that the swamp was actually an asset. That swamp was something that they were going to build around. It would be sort of a lagoon for the thing that they were going to be building. And it actually provided for them a way to have their actual project be look like it's on the ground floor, but underneath that would actually be a pretty complex system and maze of tunnels and portals and ways for people to get around if they wanted to. Well, that construction eventually began to take shape into something that you may be able to recognize at this point in time. And as that construction was taking shape, you can see kind of just the busyness that was going on in the many different areas that were taking place, the construction projects that were happening all over that. And finally, in October of 1971, Disney World was opened in Orlando. Why build Disney World? Why buy swampland in Florida? Why do all this kind of stuff? Walt Disney, long before he had built Disney World, of course, built Disneyland out in California. And here's what he said the idea came from. He said, the idea for Disneyland came about when my daughters were very young, and Saturday was always Daddy's Day with the two daughters. So we'd start out and go someplace, different things, and I'd take them to the merry-go-round, and I took them to different places, and as I'd sit while they rode the merry-go-round and did all these things, sit on a bench eating peanuts, I felt that there should be something built where parents and the children could have fun together. So that's how Disneyland started. Well, it took many years. It was a period of maybe 15 years developing. I started with many ideas, threw them all away, and started all over again. And eventually it evolved into what you see today at Disneyland. But it all started from a daddy with two daughters wondering where he could take them, where he could have a little fun with them too. I like that because Walt really had a sense of what he wanted to see happen out in front of him, way out in the future. We have been working through a series called David, a man after God's own heart. And we've seen how David's character shows up and his heart is revealed through some key encounters and key relationships throughout the course of his lifetime. We see this God's own heart unfolding in many different ways. We've gone through several different stories. Today, we're going to go through a story that quite frankly, I had overlooked many years reading through the Scriptures. I've read through the Bible many times, but one of the things that has caught my attention the past few years is this particular story and how it unfolds. It's a very important story, actually. It's sort of a how-to and how not to guide when it comes to approaching the future, which means how we govern our present as well. As we go through this story, it's a little bit different because we're talking again about David, and really to get kind of any kind of a picture or idea of the scope of what David was undertaking, it helps us to be able to see something like Disney World. Not because they're the same thing, of course. David was working on the kingdom of God, whereas Walt Disney was working on the Magic Kingdom. But you and I, if we're around Westlake very much, we've also begun to see some very impressive progress taking place. Some of you may not look at it that way, I'm sure. But we've seen a lot of development no matter what, with Sasol and all the things that are taking place in the petrochemical industry here in our area. So today we're going to take a look at a story that you will probably never hear pieced together in this way. It's one of the most fascinating stories, I think, when it comes to David. It really involves 3 generations, so it involves 2 leadership transitions. The kingdom was basically passed down from king to king through terms of father and son and lineage, through all that thing. And really what we have today is a contrast in 2 transitions and how they took place in leadership. Let me show you a couple of maps. And as you're doing it, the outline here, you can see this take place on your outline as well. On the far left, the map that you see is the United Kingdom, which is under David's control. All of Israel is one nation at this time. And what we see happening is David has a future focus, and he sees that it's going to take bringing all this together and what it's going to take to preserve all of this, and what it's going to take to set this whole country on the future that it's supposed to be. So God is his chief priority, and the king of Israel itself is another priority in him, but Solomon, his son, is also a priority in the temple that he's going to construct. David has a focus on the future that allows him to keep all of these things in perspective. And so the result of all of this is all of David's allies and all of David's connections, all of David's resources are all pointed towards the future. And as a result, what happens is Solomon and Israel are well prepared to do what God has called them to do. They're in a position to be able to fulfill the purpose that God has placed before them after David is gone. On the right, you see a different map. You see a divided kingdom. You see the northern tribes of Israel. Then you see in the pink down there at the bottom, the tribe of Judah, all kind of by itself. Here's how that happened. After David was dead, he passed the kingdom on to his son Solomon, and Solomon reigned, a very rich kingdom reigned. He was provided for greatly by his father David. But Solomon started off really well, but his focus really shifted more towards the present and how many things he could gather around himself and enrich his own life and enrich his own kingdom for the present. He really wasn't thinking so much about the future. And there's a problem with that, because the result is his son Rehoboam that took over after him split the kingdom. That's why we have northern Israel and we also the northern kingdom of Israel and the Judah in the south. There was high tension, and there never really was a resolve for all of this that took place. Rehoboam's reign was the legacy of that was a split kingdom, which is really Solomon's legacy. So what we see happening is, since Solomon may have started off great, but he fell off by all of the things that he acquired and all the things that distracted him from God's presence. As a result, his son Rehoboam and Israel were not well prepared for the future. And after Solomon was gone, we have this division that takes place. Let me set up today's story a little bit so we can kind of get into the good part of this. David, we know, was a man who had huge victories. And he also was a man who had pretty colossal defeats. We talked about his family life and some of the drama that unfolded in his family and how that was always a kind of a problem for him. The sword we talked about last week never left his home. Towards the close of David's life, he took a census. He basically said, I want to number all of my troops. I want to number my kingdom. And God really wasn't pleased with this. So God laid out some possibilities of punishments that he could exact on the kingdom. And David said, let me fall into the hands of God. The result of that was the death angel passed through Israel and killed 70,000 people in Israel. It stopped in Jerusalem at the threshing floor of Ornan, the Jebusite. David, when he saw this taking place, he said, I must go to this place where the death angel is going to stop and offer sacrifices. And Ornan says, take whatever you want. You can have my land, you can have my animals, you can have just the sacrifices. David said, I will not offer anything that costs me nothing. So David laid everything out that he had, and he sacrificed there out of gratitude for God. And he said, this is where we're going to build the temple. Up until this time, the tabernacle had been a traveling tent, basically. But God told David had in his heart to build the temple, but God said, no, you're a man of bloodshed. I really can't have you being the one who builds this temple. Your son Solomon will be a man of rest and a man of peace. He's the one that's going to build the temple for me. This is not a really exciting story. I wish I could tell you that it was. You'll not find this story in any of the Bible story books. There are no colored illustrations, all this thing. But it's a huge story, and it's one that's unfortunately many times ignored. But the failure that we have here when we approach this story, when we approach the future the way David did, is we end up with a focus on the present and the past. And we end up ill-equipped to take on the future, to face the things that are actually ahead of us that God wants to lead us through and to prepare us for. This is the failure of many families, many individuals, many churches. A focus on the present and the past while ignoring the future. And we go the way of Solomon and Rehoboam if we do that to our own demise. David and Disney had their own kind of focus on the future. And today what I would like to do is to kind of walk you through what went into that and how that really impacted not only them, but also the kingdom for years to come after that, and how God, I believe, wants to speak that word into our hearts today. I'm going to be in 1 Chronicles in chapter 22 and read 5 to the end of the chapter. So 1 Chronicles in the Old Testament, beginning in verse 5. David said, my son Solomon is young and inexperienced, and the house to be built for the Lord should be of great magnificence, fame, and splendor in the sight of all the nations. Therefore I will make preparations for it. So David made extensive preparations before his death. Then he called for his son Solomon and charged him to build the house for the Lord, the God of Israel. David said to Solomon, my son, I had it in my heart to build a house for the name of the Lord my God. But this word of the Lord came to me, you have shed much blood and have fought many wars. You are not to build a house for my name, because you have shed so much blood on the earth in my sight. But you will have a son who will be a man of peace and rest, and I will give him rest from all his enemies on every side. His name will be Solomon, and I will grant Israel peace and quiet during his reign. He's the one who will build a house for my name. He will be my son, and I will be his father, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom of Israel forever. Now, my son, the Lord be with you, and may you have success and build the house of the Lord your God, as he said you would. May the Lord give you, this is David again talking to Solomon, may the Lord give you discretion and understanding when he puts you in command over Israel, so that you may keep the law of the Lord your God. Then you will have success if you are careful to observe the decrees and laws that the Lord gave Moses for Israel. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged. I have taken great pains to provide for the temple of the Lord, 100,000 talents of gold, 1,000,000 talents of silver, quantities of bronze and iron too great to be weighed, and wood and stone. And you may add to them. You have many workmen, stone cutters, masons, and carpenters, as well as men skilled in every kind of work in gold and silver, bronze and iron, craftsmen beyond number. Now begin the work, and the Lord be with you. Then David ordered all the leaders of Israel to help his son Solomon. He said to them, is not the Lord your God with you? And has he not granted you rest on every side? For he has handed the inhabitants of the land over to me, and the land is subject to the Lord and to his people. Now devote your heart and soul to seeking the Lord your God. Begin to build the sanctuary of the Lord God, so that you may bring the ark of the covenant to the Lord, and the sacred articles belonging to God into the temple that will be built for the name of the Lord. Father, today, this is again an archaic scripture that really we have to translate a little bit. We pray, God, that today that you would be able to speak through our fog that we experience when we read through some of these passages. I pray that today, God, you would give us a window into what you want to reveal to us, not only about our own lives, but about your work and about what you want to accomplish in this world and even in this community. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be pleasing in your sight, the Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. In the name of Christ I pray. Amen. This can be a challenging passage for us as Christians. Because when we read the words of Jesus, we kind of get this sense that we're not supposed to worry about the future, that the future is something that we really have no control over. So why should we fret ourselves over the future? So there can be a disconnect for us when we begin to talk about planning for the future, because what it sounds like many times for Christians and followers of Christ is that, well, if you actually begin to plan things and organize things and structure things, you've eliminated the work of the Holy Spirit. You've violated the simplicity of the gospel. And yet you and I do this all the time. You walk through a door today, and there were people waiting for you, and there was a room that was set aside for us to gather together. These chairs were placed where they were supposed to be, and carpet has been laid several years ago. There's a sound system. There's one functional screen. That's a pretty good thing. There's all kinds of different things that have been put in place for us. Those things were made by virtue of a plan, by virtue of an organization. When you walked in this morning, you heard music. Well, those songs were written elsewhere, but they were gathered and compiled here and arranged for our band, and we practiced and all those other kinds of things that take place. And so there is this sense of organization that takes place, and planning that takes place in the life of the church, and certainly in our lives as well. You probably had somewhat of a plan when you got out of bed this morning. And if you're still in the working world, you probably have a plan for tomorrow that you're going to wake up at a certain time and go to work and do the things that you're called to do. It's how we live our lives. What Jesus was addressing primarily was our anxiety, in our worry, in our fear of the future. I don't believe he wanted us to live our lives totally lost in space. I believe he wanted us to be very diligent about the way we approach life, but not to be anxious about it. Probably the best way I've heard this comes from the quote of the week that I had while Steve and Mike and I were working over at the parsonage. Steve has a little saying that he uses, and it's It's going to be what it do. I don't really know exactly what that means, but there are things that are beyond our control that are going to take place no matter what. We can plan and we can project and we can do all these things that we want to do. Eventually, we have to let go of things. And David gives us a picture of that through this story. I don't think we have a scripture that says it's going to be what it do. But we do have David formulating a plan and working it through and then letting go of it and letting God take things from that point. God cares about your future. Do you believe that? God cares about your future. He cares about the future of the people that you love. He cares about the future of this church. He cares about all of that. So today we're going to kind of dive into this message and see what we can dig out of this. How it's possible for us to have a future after God's own heart. Let's kind of dig into this and see what David has for us as we go through these scriptures today. First of all, plan your future around God's purpose. Plan your future around God's purpose. I love verse 5 of this passage. It says, "My son Solomon is young and inexperienced, and the house to be built for the Lord should be of great magnificence and fame and splendor in the sight of all nations." You see, David recognized the purpose of what he was called to be doing in terms of building all this stuff. This was in order to establish the centerpiece of the faith of the nation of Israel. All nations had kind of their own national gods. This was the supreme God, and so the thing that David wanted to do was make sure that he was recognized as such. That this would be the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and all the earth would know it. And so this temple needed to be built in such a way that it reflected the identity of God. It reflected the glory and the majesty and the splendor of who God is. It should be better than any other temple in all the world. And so David began to work his plan around it. He knew what had to happen in this place was this sense of worship. And for worship to take place in the temple, that which we worship must be greater than us. So if we don't just kind of slap together any kind of a structure and temple that shows no design or magnificence, well, the God that we worship will probably be kind of a subpar God. That's why all of this stuff that takes place is so important. But God's purpose really involved a massive project. David was honest when he assessed all this because he said, this is a huge project and my son is going to be actually heading it up. Is very inexperienced. He doesn't have a clue what he's doing. He's just a kid. And so what we need to be able to do is design all this around this major purpose that we have. And there are two key pieces to what's going on while this is taking place. One of those pieces is a transition in leadership from David to Solomon. Another piece is this massive building project, sort of on a Disney scale. You'll see in just a few moments how big this is. Now David he was responsible for thinking about things that other people didn't have to think about. If you're a parent today, you know that your kids don't think about the same things that you do. You think about providing for them. You think about their safety. You think about all of the school they're going to. You think about their teachers. You think about their car seats. You think about all the things that are involved in their lives. They couldn't care less. Give me my phone. Give me my Game Boy. Give me whatever it is. They're thinking about a whole different set of concerns that really allow them to live a life of ease and freedom. You can't think that way because you're a parent. David couldn't think that way because he was the king and ruler of a great kingdom. He's not unlike Walt Disney in this aspect, at least. But Disney was actually relying on creativity. David was relying on discovery. What does God want? What is God's purpose for the future? I don't know if you've ever worked around those big questions. God, what do you want for my future? God, what do you see for my future? I'm just kind of going through my daily motions here. What do you actually see for me in the future? They're questions that many times we don't even bother asking, thinking about. But discovering that is something that may take us a very long time in our lives. And certainly for an organization, for a church, it takes time to discover what is God trying to accomplish with us for the sake of the future. What does God want for your future? What does God want for your family, for your future? Where do you think you're going to be in 5 years from now? The year will be 2021. I'm not telling you that you have to know, but it's good to begin to ask that question. 10 years from now will be 2026. What's your life supposed to be looking like? 2041, 25 years from now. 2066, 50 years from now, will this church even be here? Will this building be here? Will these people be here? Will some of these younger people, this baby, and some of these younger people that are here, are they going to be here? Is anybody going to be here? Is there even going to be anything here at all? Is God going to use this group of people for anything beyond today? We have to ask ourselves those questions. Because if we actually believe that God does have a future in mind, then we need to conform to that and begin to plan our present tense around the future tense that God reveals to us. If God were to show you the future for your life, just kind of an outline of what's coming and what He wants you to be heading towards, how would your plans have to change? Would you have to reevaluate the way you handle your life? Would you have to reevaluate the way you handle your time? Would you have to readjust the way you handle your money? What would you do with your life? I mean, what changes would have to be made if God impressed you with a future that you said, I must pursue this because God told me to? What kind of changes would He want to affect in your life if that were the case? We see that David is a man after God's own heart, and God reveals this to him. I think it's entirely in line with us to say, we want to be a people after God's own heart. I want to be a man after God's own heart too. You probably want to be a woman or a man after God's own heart as well. Let's take our cues from David and see what it looks like for us to be able to align ourselves, our future, with God's purposes. Secondly today, the thing that we can see from David is provide the needed resources and guidance. Provide the needed resources and guidance. You still with me? Okay, 3 of you are. I'm glad to hear that. We read in verse 5, so David made extensive preparations before his death. That's really vague. It doesn't really tell us what extensive preparations look like, but the scriptures around that actually do. Let me walk you through from this vague, non-specific definition to what this meant for David to be providing for the future, for his son Solomon and for Israel. Verses 2 through 4 of this chapter, we see that David has drafted workmen, he's drafted craftsmen, he's drafted carpenters, masons, stonecutters. He's drafted all these people to begin working already. The stones that were to be cut were not to be cut inside the temple area. Everything that was going to be taking place in terms of construction needed to take place outside of the temple area because there was to be no visible signs of man-made stuff in the temple. In other words, these massive stones had to be cut outside and brought in. That's the way this is going to be constructed. It's a big deal. Verses 14 through 16 give us a list of the materials that David's provided. We don't know what a talent is a lot of times when we're reading these things. But let me clue you in a little bit on how much gold is involved here. In Fort Knox today, there are 4,500 tons of gold. 4,500, not ounces, not pounds, tons. 4,500 tons of gold, Fort Knox. David's calculation here of what he's talking about to give to Solomon is 3,700 tons of gold. That's not that far short of Fort Knox. That's a huge amount of provision. And on top of that, 10 times that in silver. He begins to talk about the iron and the bronze. And he talks about the iron. Listen, son, you're going to need nails for this. So I'm going to provide you iron. You're going to need gates for this. I'm going to provide you all of these materials. He begins to pour out all these things that are beyond number. David has alliances and relationships with foreign countries like Tyre and Sidon. And he says, I'm going to bring you cedar and provide cedar from these foreign countries. They're going to bring you stuff, even though they don't really like us a lot. They're going to do it because we're stronger than they are. Verse 17, we begin to see David say, I'm going to surround you with leaders. These people, these wise people that you know, they're going to be your guides through all this. I'm commanding them to support you as you go through all this. Chapter 23 through 26, what do we see happen? We see David organizing, listen to the numbers, around 40,000 priests and Levites to oversee the construction, oversee the protection of the city, oversee the gates, oversee the worship that takes place, oversee all of these things. 40,000 spiritual leaders David is organizing for Solomon, so Solomon will not have to do that. Then we see in chapter 27, David organizes the military for Solomon. He sets up all the tribal heads and the generals and all those things. Chapter 28, David lays out the blueprints and the plans, and here's what this is supposed to look like and how you go about making this. Chapter 29, David calls for a massive capital campaign where materials and gold and all these things come in unmeasurable quantities. David has positioned Solomon in ways that are unbelievable in terms of providing for him the things he's going to need to do the things that he's called to do. The scope of this is something that you and I just simply can't fathom. I was sitting down the other night with a reliability engineer from Sassaw, and he had moved here from Houston. He said, I had no idea the scope of this project. I go out on a different site every other, every so often. It's amazing to see the progress that's taking place. It's unbelievable, the scope of this thing. You see, once we get a glimpse of God's purpose and what He wants to accomplish for the future, we got to actually begin planning for that and organizing and doing these things around it, providing the resources that are necessary for it, and the guidance that's necessary for it as well. The future is a big deal to God. And so this purpose is to be approached with a sense of value and worth and commitment. I don't know about you, but many times I feel lucky if I just get through the week. If I can just get the dollars to match up on the income with bills, it's a pretty good deal. That's just kind of getting by. And many of us live kind of along those lines. What if God is actually saying, you know what? You may not think you're rich, but you're spending too much on your present. You actually are supposed to be planning for the future in different ways. Yes, your own personal finances, but I want you investing in the things that are eternal. I want you doing some things with your resources that are bigger than what you're doing right now. You're shortchanging yourself. And you're shortchanging all the things that I want you to be involved in. I've got some plans. And I want you to be a part of those things. You're spending on yourself. You're like Solomon. You're spending on your present. I'm talking to myself now. And God says, listen, there's some things I want to accomplish. Are you willing to work with me? Are you willing to provide for these things that are supposed to be taking place over the course of the future? Let me give you one more contrast here in the transition that takes place between David and Solomon, and between Solomon and Rehoboam. You still with me on these generation things, right? David is the king, his son is Solomon, Solomon's son is Rehoboam. So we've got these three generations and these two transitions that are going to take place. David's future focus is something that's very different than Solomon's present focus, because we see Rehoboam's outcome as a result of all this. You see, Solomon's success as a king is due to the fact that David was so diligent in providing everything that he needed to accomplish what God called him to do. On the other side, Rehoboam was totally ill-equipped, because Solomon took all the resources that had come his way, and he basically enriched the kingdom in his long life and began to tax the people heavily, so that when it was time for him to transition the kingdom to his son Rehoboam, there was rebellion. Something that was unforeseen for David. Rehoboam's failure is due to the fact that Solomon handled the transition differently than his father David had handled that. What is God's purpose for us? Are we content with just kind of going along and day to day and doing our thing? Or is God going to call us to provide for something in the future? I'm not sure what it would be. By the way, I'm not announcing a new building program. Relax. But God's kingdom is bigger than that. Next week when we have Stephen Nelson here, one of the things I believe God will call this church to do and other churches to do as well is, hey, we're not going to be able to reach everybody, and so why not help people who are reaching other people that we can't reach? It may be that God uses this church as a means of supporting other works, that God is doing some things. It's consistent with what we've been doing already. We've supported the Westwood Pantry with food and volunteering. We've supported Glean in our community. We've supported lots of different things, Operation Christmas Child, to be sure. Hope House. The goal is not to reinvent the wheel for us. Much of what God has shown us to do has been actually just kind of help other people who are already doing the things that are beyond our reach. Finally today, let me finish up. A future after God's own heart. The third piece of this is encourage and bless those who follow you. Those who are following you. Let me read this passage that I kind of read quickly at the very beginning. Verses 11 through 13 say this: Now, my son, the Lord be with you, and may you have success and build the house of the Lord your God as he said you would. May the Lord give you discretion and understanding when he puts you in command over Israel, so that you may keep the law of the Lord your God. And you will have success if you're careful to observe the decrees and laws that the Lord gave Moses for Israel. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged. Those words are actually kind of familiar, aren't they? They come when Moses is charging Joshua many years before this. Be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid. Don't be discouraged. All of David's understanding of God's purpose and all of his efforts in the provision that he was making, all of that had to be trusted into his son Solomon's hand. I can't imagine letting go of the things that I've laid out for you this morning, letting go of that and trusting them to someone else that you're not really sure how they're going to do. He knew that Solomon was going to face challenges. He knew that Solomon was going to end up being discouraged from time to time. He knew that without courage, having a great plan, having great resources, having all the guidance, and having all those things is just simply not enough. You need the personal fortitude in order to do the things that God calls you to do. Now, that's just kind of how things work. So David invested personally into Solomon and gave him this charge. He gave him these instructions. He gave him this encouragement. What do we see happening when Solomon transitions the kingdom from himself to his son Rehoboam? We don't see any of this. We see Solomon just kind of saying, well, I had a kid out of my 700 wives. I think I'll pick this one and I'll make him king. We don't really have this process unfolding when Solomon is getting ready to pass the kingdom on to his son Rehoboam. And so the problem that we have is we have this wonderful wise man named Solomon who has given us the Proverbs, the book of Ecclesiastes, the Song of Songs, which nobody understands, but that's okay. All the wisdom that we have in the scriptures through the wisdom literature, much of it Solomon has shared, and he even addresses it and says, my son, and yet we see when his son takes over, his son is a total idiot. He's incompetent, and he blows the whole thing. He wrecks the kingdom. In the span of a week, it goes from being a glorious kingdom to be a divided kingdom that is forever torn apart. How do you do that? How do you pass this stuff, all these things onto your son who's a total moron? How do you do that? Solomon was able to counsel people for billions of people for generations to come after that. I read these wonderful things that Solomon wrote. You do too. And my life is guided by the wisdom that Solomon has given us in the scriptures. However, his son missed the whole thing. How does that happen? I don't know how it happens, but it did. And it's costly. I thank God all the time for my parents. You've heard me talk about this Psalm 16:6. The lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Indeed, I have a beautiful inheritance. I was given the legacy of faith. My parents raised me in a Christian home. I never wanted for anything. I mean, we weren't filthy rich, but my parents invested in me. They invested in my brother. They invested in their parents. They've invested in their grandkids. I look at my dad and my mom, and I'm just amazed at what they've accomplished with their lives. I feel like I owe this world a debt because I've been so blessed. I mean, I've just been incredibly well blessed, and I really feel like I'm in debt. Because of that, God has just given me so much that I really feel like I owe you, and I owe this community, and I owe just simply because I'm so blessed I need to be able to share that. This past spring when I was with my parents, I've told you a few times that I really sense God was saying to me, you need, at this point in your life, to look at the future. You need to begin to look at the people who are around you, these younger people, and you need to begin to encourage and bless them. Because if this church that you're pastoring is going to have a future, it's not because you're just a great guy. It's your success will be defined. And please don't use that word. Are you freaked out by that? I don't mean the Mercedes success. I mean the legacy, not even my name legacy. I mean just the work of God continuing. That's success for me. If we fail here, if we fail at equipping people younger than us, what's their life? There is no future. That's my calling. And I really believe that as a church, we're called to be doing it. I am glad that we have Eric leading worship, Eric and Mandy leading youth as well. I have said over and over again, if you could have heard me leading worship when I was Eric's age, this is what you would do. And you would say, Dear Lord Jesus, please. This is a nice kid. I like him and everything, but oh, God save us. You have the luxury, and many people in terms of my ministry have had the luxury of hearing me after many seasons of ministry. God uses seasons to refine us. I want this church to be a place where people who are in their 20s, 30s, teens can experience the seasoning. The grace that comes from a church like this that allows people their ministries to season. That's where maturity comes in. And that's where the future comes in.